cracking of a dead branch was the only announcement she gave. Reese didn't even turn from the axe he was sharpening, the rhythmic scrape of stone against steel a meditation against the oppressive summer heat. He'd lived in these mountains long enough to know the sound of every creature, from the heavy tread of a bear to the whisper-light step of a fox. This was different. This was the clumsy, desperate sound of a thing that did not belong. He set the stone down, his massive frame uncoiling with a slow, deliberate tension. His hand rested on the handle of the axe, knuckles white. The forest was his sanctuary, a fortress of pine and rock built to keep the world out. Whatever was coming had breached the wall. She stumbled from the tree line, a ghost in the shimmering air. Her dress, a tattered beige thing meant for a prairie far from this unforgiving granite, was torn and stained with dirt and something darker. She was young, Chinese, her face a mask of exhaustion and terror, framed by tangled black hair. She saw him and her legs gave out, a final surrender to whatever ordeal had driven her up his mountain. She fell to her knees in the dust. "Please," she whispered, the word a dry rasp. "Help me." Reese remained motionless, a bearded statue carved from the mountain itself. His eyes, narrowed against the glare, took in the details, the bare feet, bruised and bleeding, the thinness of her arms, the panic in her gaze. He had seen fear before. He had caused it. But this was the fear of a hunted animal, cornered and expecting the final blow. He took a half step forward, his shadow falling over her. She flinched, raising her hands to shield her face, a gesture so reflexive it spoke of long acquaintance with violence. It was then that he saw them, the scars. Raw, chafed circles of ruined flesh around each delicate wrist, the skin puckered and discolored. They were rope burns, old and new, layered over one another like rings on a tree, each one telling a story of captivity. She lowered her hands, her body trembling, and as the collar of her dress shifted, he saw another mark, a brand seared into the skin just above her collarbone. It was a crude symbol, a crossed pickaxe and shovel. He froze. The axe in his hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a dead weight pulling him down into a memory he had spent a decade trying to outrun. The heat, the dust, the desperate plea, it all swirled into a vortex that dragged him back to a different place, a different woman, and a failure so profound it had hollowed him out. The world telescoped down to those marks, symbols of ownership, of a life stolen and defined by another's cruelty. He saw her lips move again, but the sound was lost in the roaring in his ears, the sound of a promise he had broken long ago. He carried her inside the cabin, his movements stiff, mechanical. The cabin was a single room, smelling of pine smoke, leather, and solitude. Sunlight cut through the single grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and tracing the ugly topography of her injuries. He fetched a bucket of water from the rain barrel, his hands, calloused and scarred from a life of hard labor and harder fights, fumbling with the ladle. He dipped a clean rag into the cool water and hesitated. His gaze was fixed on the brand. It wasn't the same symbol, not the one from his past, but its meaning was universal. It was a claim, a mark of property. A voice echoed in his memory, soft and pleading, followed by the sharp, final crack of a gunshot. His sister. He squeezed his eyes shut, the muscles in his jaw clenching so hard they ached. Her name was Anna. She had trusted him. He had been strong, a brawler and a roughneck, but his strength had meant nothing when the men came. They hadn't branded her with iron, but with bruises, and a fear that had extinguished the light in her eyes long before they took her life. He had been too late, arriving to a silent homestead and a cold body. The guilt was a physical thing, a shard of ice lodged permanently in his chest. He had hunted down the men responsible, one by one, leaving a trail of bodies that had forced him into this self-imposed exile. But vengeance had been a hollow victory. It hadn't brought her back. It hadn't erased the image of her broken form. Opening his eyes, he looked at the young woman on his cot. He saw the same haunted look he remembered in Anna's eyes during her last days. This was his penance. A second chance, sent by a god he no longer believed in. He gently dabbed the wet rag on her forehead, cleaning away the grime. His touch was surprisingly delicate for a man his size. He cleaned the cuts on her feet, his movements slow and methodical. When he reached her wrists, he paused. He wrapped the clean, wet cloth around the raw flesh, his breath catching in his throat. This time he would not be too late. This time his strength would mean something. The promise he made was silent, a vow to the ghost in his memory and the fragile life breathing before him. She woke with a gasp, her eyes wide with terror as they fixed on the massive shape of him sitting in a chair across the room. She scrambled backward on the cot, pulling the rough blanket up to her chin like a shield. The sudden movement sent a fresh wave of pain through her, and she winced, a small cry escaping her lips. Reese held up his hands, palms open, a gesture of peace that seemed incongruous with his formidable presence. "You're safe here," he said, his voice a low rumble, rusty from disuse. He hadn't spoken more than a handful of words at a time for years. She watched him, her breathing rapid and shallow. He saw the calculation in her eyes. Was he a savior or just another captor? He pushed a tin cup of water toward her on the small crate beside the bed. "Drink." She stared at the cup, then back at him, her distrust a palpable force in the small room. Finally, her thirst won. She reached a trembling hand out and took it, drinking greedily. He waited until she was done. "My name is Reese. What's yours?" She hesitated for a long moment, swallowing hard. "Lynn." The name was a fragile whisper. "Who did this to you, Lynn?" he asked, his voice gentle but firm. Her eyes darted toward the door, as if expecting her pursuers to burst through it at any moment. "They'll find me," she whispered, her voice cracking with fear. "They find everyone." "Who are they?" Reese pressed, leaning forward slightly. The movement made her flinch again, and he settled back, cursing himself for his own intimidating size. He needed her to trust him, but he was a monster from a fairy tale, all tangled hair and brute muscle. "The company," she said, her gaze distant, lost in the horror of her memories. "The men who work for Mr. Finch." She described him not by his appearance, but by his nature. A man who never raised his voice, whose orders were given in a calm, almost pleasant tone that was more terrifying than any shout. A man whose eyes were empty of everything but calculation. She told him about the camp, hidden deep in the next valley, where they were blasting a path through the mountains for the railroad. She spoke of dozens of others like her, brought from across the ocean with promises of work and a new life, only to find themselves enslaved, their lives worth less than the rock they were forced to break. "I ran," she said, looking down at her scarred wrists. "They were moving me to a different tent for Mr. Finch. I saw a chance. I just ran." The implication hung in the air, thick and poisonous. Reese felt the shard of ice in his chest twist. It was the same story, just with different names and faces. Men who saw people as objects, to be used, marked, and discarded. His isolation had been a lie, a retreat. The world he had fled had followed him up the mountain, carried in the form of this broken young woman. He looked at her, huddled on his cot, a world of pain in her dark eyes, and he knew his exile was over. Before dawn, Reese moved out. He left Lynn with a bowl of stew, a loaded pistol she eyed with terror, and a simple instruction: Don't open the door for anyone but me." He didn't wait for a reply. He melted into the pre-dawn gloom, his heavy boots making no sound on the pine-needle-strewn earth. He was a hunter again, but his prey was not deer or bear. He moved with a grim purpose, following the faint trail of broken twigs and scuffed earth she had left in her desperate flight. The sun was beginning to crest the eastern peaks when he found the overlook. Lying flat on a granite slab, concealed by a cluster of junipers, he peered down into the valley below. It was worse than he had imagined. The camp wasn't just a rough collection of tents. It was a machine. A scar of industry carved into the pristine wilderness. A line of men, their backs bent, swung pickaxes in a relentless, brutal rhythm against a sheer rock face. He saw the pens she had described, crude wooden cages where the workers were likely kept at night. In the center of the camp stood a larger tent, and outside it a man in a clean duster coat observed the work. He was of average height and build, his face unremarkable except for the chilling stillness of his expression. He held a pocket watch, checking the time with an air of detached efficiency. As Reese watched, a worker stumbled, dropping his pickaxe from exhaustion. A guard immediately descended, the butt of his rifle rising and falling. The worker didn't get up. 2 others were ordered to drag the body away, and another man was pushed forward to take his place. The man in the duster coat didn't even flinch. He simply closed his watch with a soft click and returned it to his pocket. This had to be Finch. Reese felt a cold, familiar rage begin to burn in his gut. This wasn't just cruelty. It was a system. An orderly, passionless process of grinding human beings into dust for profit. He saw Lynn's people, their faces gaunt, their movements shuffling and spiritless. They were ghosts, already dead but forced to keep moving. He watched for hours, memorizing the guards' patrol routes, the layout of the camp, the location of the explosives shed. He noted the way Finch commanded his men with quiet gestures, a flick of the wrist, a nod of the head. He was the brain, and the guards were his unthinking limbs. The sun beat down on Reese's back, the granite warming beneath him, but he felt only a spreading coldness inside. He had built a life of silence and solitude to escape this very thing, to forget the sound of a man's bones breaking under his fists. But looking down at that valley of despair, he understood. You can't run from the world. You can only decide where you'll make your stand. He returned to the cabin as dusk painted the sky in shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Lynn was exactly where he had left her, sitting on the cot, the untouched pistol on the floor beside her. She looked up as he entered, her eyes asking the question she was too afraid to voice. He didn't need to speak. The grim set of his jaw, the hardness in his eyes was answer enough. He had seen it. He believed her. He walked to the hearth and began building a fire, his movements economical and precise. The simple domestic act seemed out of place with the violence simmering beneath his skin. "There are maybe 15 guards," he said, his back to her, "and him, Finch." The name fell like a stone in the quiet room. "Too many," Lynn whispered, her voice barely audible. "One man cannot—" "No," Reese agreed, turning to face her. The firelight flickered across his rugged features, making his face a landscape of shadows and harsh angles. "One man can't, but one man can break the cage." He saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, so faint and fragile he was afraid his own breath might extinguish it. He had to be honest with her, with himself. "I can't promise we'll succeed. I can't promise you'll be safe. But I promise I will not leave them there." It was the closest he could come to articulating the vow he had made to his sister's memory. He looked at his own hands, holding them up in the firelight. They were tools of survival, capable of building a shelter, skinning a deer, or ending a life. For 10 years they had been idle, instruments of a self-imposed penance. Now they had a purpose again. "Why?" Lynn asked, her gaze fixed on him. "Why would you do this? For me? A stranger?" The question struck him harder than any physical blow. He thought of Anna, of the helplessness and the rage, of the empty vengeance that had followed. He thought of the decade he had spent hiding from his own humanity. "Because I didn't do it before," he said, his voice thick with a grief that time had not dulled. "Someone needed help, and I was too late." He wasn't just talking to Lynn anymore. He was speaking to the ghost that haunted his every waking moment. The fire crackled, filling the silence. Lynn pulled the blanket tighter around herself, but her eyes never left his. The fear was still there, but it was now mingled with something else. A shared understanding of loss, of pain inflicted by a cruel world. "They treat people like animals," she said softly. Reese shook his head, the firelight catching the feral glint in his eyes. "Worse," he growled. "Animals are hunted for need. This is for sport, for pride." He picked up the pistol from the floor and checked the cylinder. This time, he wouldn't be avenging the dead. He would be fighting for the living. The night was a long one, spent not in sleep, but in preparation. Reese moved about the cabin with the quiet intensity of a predator preparing for a hunt. He laid out his weapons on the small wooden table, a heavy Sharps rifle, a Colt revolver, and a long, wicked-looking Bowie knife. He cleaned each one with meticulous care, the scent of gun oil filling the small space. Each metallic click of a cylinder spinning or a lever being worked was a punctuation mark in the heavy silence. Lynn watched him, her fear warring with a dawning sense of awe. This man was more than just a mountain hermit. He was a warrior, reawakening a part of himself that he had tried to bury. He wasn't teaching her how to fight, wasn't offering her a weapon again. He was simply letting her witness his transformation, the quiet hardening of his resolve. He packed a small leather satchel with dried meat, a water skin, and strips of cloth for bandages. He was a realist. He knew the odds. He was planning not just for the fight, but for the aftermath. He pulled out a worn map of the territory, spreading it on the table. He traced a route with a thick finger, a winding, difficult path through the highest, most treacherous passes. "Here," he said, his voice low. "This is where you'll take them. It leads over the state line. It will be hard, but they won't follow you that far. Too much trouble for them." He was already speaking as if it was a certainty, as if the escape was already in motion. "You must keep them moving. Don't stop until you reach the town of Redemption." He looked up at her. "Can you do that?" She stared at the map, at the impossible line he had drawn. She was a runaway, not a leader. But then she looked at Reese, at the sheer force of will radiating from him, and felt a spark ignite within her own exhausted spirit. She thought of the faces in the camp, the empty eyes, the resigned shuffle of their feet. If he was willing to risk his life for them, for strangers, how could she do any less? "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than it had been since she arrived. "I can do that." He gave a single curt nod of approval. He wasn't offering comfort or false hope. He was offering a chance, a brutal, bloody, narrow path out of hell. He pulled on a dark leather vest and strapped the knife to his belt. He slung the rifle over his shoulder. He stood in the center of the cabin, a figure of immense power and grim purpose, ready to descend from his mountain and unleash a storm on the men in the valley. The quiet recluse was gone, replaced by the man he used to be, the man Anna had known, the man who had failed her once but would not fail again. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. It was a night for shadows, and Reese wore them like a cloak. He moved down the mountain with an eerie silence, his big frame seeming to glide through the dense undergrowth. He reached the ridge overlooking the camp and waited, his patience as solid as the rock beneath him. The camp was quiet. Most of the guards were clustered around a central fire, their talk and laughter carrying faintly on the night air. 2 patrolled the perimeter, their routes predictable, their attention lax. He had studied them all day, learned their rhythms, their moments of inattention. He started with the rock slide. High above the western edge of the camp, he had spent part of the afternoon loosening a collection of boulders, balancing them precariously. Now, with a long, sturdy branch, he applied pressure to the keystone. It resisted, then groaned, and then the entire ledge gave way. The sound was cataclysmic, a deafening roar of stone grinding against stone that shattered the night's tranquility. Boulders the size of men crashed down the slope, shaking the very ground. Shouts of alarm rose from the camp below as guards scrambled, their attention completely drawn to the chaos. That was his first diversion. While their eyes were turned west, he was already moving east towards the explosive shed. It was a small, crudely built structure set away from the main camp for safety. The lock was heavy, but the door frame was cheap pine. One powerful kick and the wood splintered, the door swinging inward. He worked quickly, his hands sure in the dark. He took several sticks of dynamite and a length of fuse. He didn't want a massive explosion, just enough to create a second point of panic. He set the charge against the far wall of the mess tent, lit the fuse, and retreated back into the darkness. The fuse hissed, a tiny, deadly snake in the grass. He was halfway to the workers' pens when the dynamite went off. It wasn't as loud as the rock slide, but it was more shocking. The mess tent erupted in a flash of orange light, canvas and wood splinters flying through the air. The screams that followed were no longer of alarm, but of genuine panic. The camp's orderly brutality had been fractured. Fire was spreading from the ruined tent. Men were shouting contradictory orders. The guards who had run towards the rock slide now turned and ran back towards the fire. Their system, their cold control, had been broken by pure, unpredictable chaos. And in the heart of that chaos, a lone, shadowy figure moved with deadly purpose toward the locked cages. He reached the pens as the pandemonium peaked. The workers inside were pressed against the rough-hewn bars, their faces a mixture of terror and confusion. The heavy chain and padlock on the main gate looked formidable, but Reese had come prepared. He pulled a small, heavy sledgehammer from his belt. The first strike sent a deafening clang across the compound, but it was lost in the greater noise of the fire and the shouting. The second strike dented the lock. The third shattered it. The chain fell away with a clatter. He pulled the heavy gate open. "Go," he growled, his voice a low command. "To the north. Follow the creek up the mountain. Now." They stared at him, uncomprehending, their spirits so thoroughly broken that the concept of freedom was alien. They were paralyzed by fear. A voice, calm and laced with amusement, cut through the noise from behind him. "A ghost from the mountain! How wonderfully dramatic!" Reese turned slowly. Mr. Finch stood there, a revolver in his hand, looking utterly unruffled by the chaos Reese had unleashed. "A brutish but effective touch. You've cost a brutish but effective touch. You've cost me a great deal of time and money." "Let 'em go," Reese said, his hand hovering over the butt of his own pistol. "They aren't property." Finch smiled, a cold, thin-lipped expression devoid of any warmth. "Everything is property, my friend. Some of us are just more honest about it. You, for instance. You fight for them. You believe you are their savior. That makes them yours in a way. Your responsibility. Your burden." He raised his pistol, aiming not at Reese, but at a man cowering in the now open pen. "And burdens," Finch continued softly, "can be so easily lightened." The shot was deafening in the small space between them. The worker in the cage collapsed without a sound. The others screamed, scrambling back from the gate. A switch flipped in Reese's mind. The controlled rage gave way to pure primal fury.
He didn't draw his pistol.
That was too slow. In a single explosive movement, he launched himself forward, grabbing the barrel of the nearest guard's rifle and shoving it aside as it fired, the shot going wide. He slammed the butt of the rifle into the man's face, then spun, driving his elbow into the throat of the second guard. It was brutal, efficient, and over in seconds. Finch fired again, the bullet searing a hot line across Reese's ribs, but Reese was already on him. He drove his shoulder into Finch's chest, sending them both crashing to the dusty ground. It was no longer a fight of guns, but of raw, desperate strength. Reese's world narrowed to the man beneath him. Finch was wiry and surprisingly strong, fighting with a cold, vicious efficiency. He clawed at Reese's eyes, his fingers like talons. Reese ignored the pain, the fire in his side, and slammed his fist into Finch's face. The crunch of bone was satisfying. He hit him again, the rage a roaring furnace inside him. This was for Anna. This was for Lynn. This was for the nameless man Finch had just executed with casual disdain. He raised his fist for a final blow, but a shout stopped him. "Reese!" It was Lynn. She stood at the edge of the firelight, her face pale with terror but her posture resolute. Behind her, the other workers huddled, their eyes fixed on the brutal scene. They were free, but they were still trapped by their fear. They needed a leader. Reese looked from the bloody face of Finch to the hopeful, terrified face of Lynn. Killing this man would be easy. It would be just. But it would be vengeance, the same empty poison that had driven him into exile. Redemption was something different. It was saving them, not destroying him. He grabbed the dazed Finch by his coat, hauled him to his feet, and threw him into one of the empty pens, slamming the gate and dropping the broken lock back into place, jamming it shut. It wouldn't hold for long, but it didn't need to. He turned to the workers. "She will lead you," he said, gesturing to Lynn. "Follow her. Do not stop. Do not look back. Live." For a moment they still hesitated. Then Lynn stepped forward and spoke to them in their own tongue. Her voice was not loud, but it carried a new authority, forged in desperation and hope. She was no longer the broken victim who had collapsed in his clearing. She was a survivor, a leader. She pointed to the dark mountains, the path to freedom he had shown her. One by one, then in a rush, they moved. They poured out of the camp, a silent, ragged stream of humanity, disappearing into the northern darkness. Lynn was the last to leave. She paused and looked back at Reese, her eyes conveying a gratitude that no words could capture. "Go," he urged, his voice rough with pain and emotion. She nodded, and then she was gone. Reese stood alone in the center of the ruined camp. The fire was dying down. The surviving guards were beginning to regroup. He was wounded, exhausted, and outnumbered. But as he watched the last of the freed workers vanish into the night, he felt the icy shard in his chest finally begin to melt. He turned, picked up his rifle, and limped towards the southern shadows, a different direction from the escapees. He had one more role to play, the decoy. Dawn found him miles away, high on a ridge overlooking the valley. The sun's first rays touched the peaks, setting them ablaze with golden light. His side was a constant throbbing agony, the makeshift bandage on his ribs soaked through. Below, he could see the distant figures of riders fanning out from the ruined camp, but they were heading south and east, following the false trail of blood he had deliberately left for them. They were hunting him. Let them. Every step they took in his direction was a step away from Lynn and the others. He was alone again, as he had been for a decade. But the solitude felt different now. The silence of the mountains was no longer a punishment, a wall to hide his guilt behind. It was a choice, a sanctuary he had earned. He thought of his sister, Anna. The memory was still painful, a scar on his soul that would never fade. But for the first time, it wasn't accompanied by the crushing weight of failure. He hadn't been able to save her, but he had honored her memory in the only way that mattered. He had saved someone else. He had stood between the innocent and the cruel, and he had not faltered. He looked at his hands. They were bruised, scraped, and stained with the blood of his enemies and his own. They were the hands of a violent man. But they had also been gentle when they cleaned Lynn's wounds. They had broken a lock. They had opened a cage. They had pointed the way to freedom. Guilt is a strange country. It can be a prison locking you in the past, or it can be a map pointing the way toward a better future. What defines a man? Is it the single, catastrophic failure that breaks him, or the choice, years later, to stand up and try again, knowing the cost? Reese didn't have the answer. He only knew that as he watched the sun rise, casting long shadows from the peaks, he felt lighter. The ghost on his shoulder was still there, but she was no longer weeping. She was watching the northern horizon, where a small band of survivors was walking toward a new day. And for the first time in a very long time, Reese felt something that resembled peace. He was the mountain man, the isolated protector, but he was no longer a prisoner.